They say everyone has a story. But some stories take you on a journey, through those really dark corners of human nature. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a story just like that. Tony Ray Amati hosts Speaker. This guy ended up on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, and it's just wild. This guy was a model student on paper, even had a job. But man, something went terribly wrong. Host Speaker, we've got court documents, news articles, FBI files, the whole 9 yards. It's going to be a wild ride, so I've brought in an expert to help us make sense of it all. What's the first thing that jumps out at you about Amati's early life?
It's that contrast that really gets you right away. Like, here's this guy who graduated high school with honors, working as a telemarketer, even had a doctor describe him as having a personality perfectly suited for accounting.
Wow.
Yet this seemingly ordinary life takes a hard left into a brutal crime spree.
It's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde thing. Like, you'd think a telemarketer, someone who needs to be persuasive and build rapport with people, would use those skills for good, not manipulate people into dangerous situations.
That's such a good point. The skills we build up in everyday life can be so powerful. In Amati's case, they took a dark turn.
So we've got this seemingly normal guy with a hidden dark side. What was the catalyst? What tipped him over the edge?
Well, in 1996, Amati, along with these two guys, Troy Sampson and Edward James, they decided to rob a gun store in Vegas.
Bold move.
Oh, yeah. They got away with $30,000 and 75 firearms. I think right there, that's your major turning point.
Yeah, it's like they were gearing up for something big, something dangerous. And they didn't waste any time, did they?
No, they did not.
Yeah.
Their first victim was Michael Matta, a homeless man. They shot him multiple times.
Just awful. Really a stark reminder of the human cost of these crimes, these families, these lives shattered in an instant.
Absolutely.
And it's so random, so senseless. What could possibly have driven them to target a homeless man?
That is one of the most unsettling parts of this case. The randomness of their violence just adds a layer of fear and uncertainty, right? I mean, it makes you question the very fabric of safety and security in a community.
For sure. Then just weeks later, they strike again, killing John Garcia in his garage. It's like they were on this horrific power trip.
It's a clear escalation of violence, a blatant disregard for human life. And it all culminates a month later with the murder of Keith Dyer. They shot him outside a friend's house and even wounded a witness, Stacy Dooley, in the process.
So we've got this horrifying crime spree, but at some point, the police had to catch a break, right?
Yeah, they did, and it came from a pretty surprising source. You remember those stolen guns from the robbery?
Yeah.
Well, Amati and his crew, they tried to sell some of them to an undercover officer.
Wow, talk about a rookie mistake.
I know, right?
So that led to the arrests of Sampson and James. But Amati, he managed to slip away.
He did, and that is where the manhunt begins. For 2 years, Amati lived as a phantom, basically. He used aliases, moved from state to state, even got picked up by the police in Utah multiple times without anyone realizing who he was.
Hold on. He got arrested multiple times and they didn't figure it out. How is that even possible?
It's got to be a combination of Amati's, cunning and maybe a little bit of luck. He was good at blending in, creating false identities. And law enforcement databases, they weren't as sophisticated back then. It was easier to slip through the cracks.
So he's on the run, living this double life. What finally brings him down?
Public pressure, actually. In 1998, Amati made it onto the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. That brought national attention to the case, and he was even featured on America's Most Wanted.
Oh, that's a game changer. Millions of eyes looking for this guy now.
Exactly. And it worked. A viewer tip from someone in Georgia led to Amati's capture in Atlanta. The power of the media, the public's involvement. It really played a pivotal role in bringing him to justice.
That's amazing. But that wasn't the end of the story, was it?
No, it wasn't.
Okay, let's unpack that. So Amati's caught, but the case gets even more complicated, right?
It does. Remember, his accomplices, Sampson and James, they were initially charged with murder as well. But those charges were dropped because some evidence was withheld.
Hold on. Evidence was withheld? That doesn't seem right.
It's a complex legal issue. Sometimes evidence is deemed inadmissible if it was obtained improperly or if it's more prejudicial than probative. In this case, the withheld evidence significantly weakened the prosecution's case against Sampson and James, led to the dismissal of the murder charges.
So because of a legal technicality, they walked free, even though they were involved in the robbery and present at the murders.
Yeah, essentially. It highlights how crucial due process and the burden of proof are in our legal system. Without that evidence, the prosecution couldn't prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
All right, so Sampson and James, they catch a break. But what about Amati? He's the one they caught in Atlanta.
Right, right. He finally stood trial in 1999. Now, Amati had a defense strategy, and it was a rather interesting one. He claimed that he acted out of fear of Samson and never actually pulled the trigger himself.
Ah, the fear defense. I can see how that might work in some cases. But with all the evidence against him, could he really convince a jury?
That's the big question, right? Was his fear genuine and reasonable enough to justify his actions? Or was it just a desperate attempt to escape accountability? The jury had to carefully weigh the evidence and decide whether his fear was credible or not.
And what did they decide?
Well, they found him guilty of Keith Dyer's murder, but acquitted him of the murders of Michael Matta and John Garcia. A split verdict, which means they didn't see him as simply guilty or innocent across the board.
So, convicted of one murder, not the others, adds another layer of complexity to an already twisted story, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Even with the conviction, there's a sense of ambiguity of unfinished business, and then there are the long-term repercussions to consider, the impact on the victims' families, the community.
And that's what we'll delve into next, because this story doesn't end in the courtroom. The consequences of Amati's actions have reverberated through lives and a community for years. We've been talking about Tony Ray Amati, the thrill killer, and all the twists and turns of his case. But the courtroom drama is just one part of this whole story. What about the aftermath? How do you even begin to measure the impact of crimes like these?
It's tough. The impact of violent crime, it extends so far beyond just the immediate victims. It ripples outwards, leaving these lasting scars on families, communities, even society as a whole.
We know that Keith Dyer's mother, she passed away shortly after the trial. It's just heartbreaking to think that she just couldn't cope with the loss of her son.
Yeah, it really speaks to the profound and just enduring grief that violent crime inflicts. The pain doesn't just end with a conviction or a sentence. It can linger for years, even generations.
And it's not just the families who are affected. I mean, the community of Las Vegas, they must have been deeply shaken by these events.
Absolutely. I mean, just imagine living in a city where these seemingly random acts of violence occur. It erodes this sense of safety and security that a community relies on. Suddenly everyday activities like walking down the street or going to the grocery store become tinged with anxiety and fear.
Right. You'd think that after Amati was caught, that fear would subside, but I imagine it's not that simple.
No, not really. The psychological impact of these crimes, it can linger long after the perpetrator is behind bars. People may become more vigilant, more suspicious, less trusting of others. It can really change the very fabric of a community.
It's crazy. Let's go back to those arrests in Utah for a second. You mentioned that Amati was apprehended multiple times, but he managed to convince the police he was someone else. It's almost comical in a dark way that he could pull that off repeatedly.
It does seem incredible, doesn't it? But it speaks to Amati's ability to just manipulate, deceive. He clearly had a knack for creating these convincing false identities and adapting his behavior to kind of fit the situation.
So it was a combination of cunning and luck that allowed him to slip through the cracks so many times.
Exactly. And it highlights, some of the limitations of law enforcement at the time. Communication between agencies wasn't as seamless as it is today, and databases weren't as comprehensive. It was easier to disappear, reinvent yourself, stay one step ahead of the authorities.
And then America's Most Wanted enters the picture. It's fascinating how a television show can have such a real-world impact on criminal investigations.
Oh, for sure. It's a testament to the power of public engagement. America's Most Wanted tapped into this collective desire for justice, harnessing the eyes and ears of millions of viewers to help track down fugitives. It created a sense of shared responsibility, empowering everyday citizens to play an active role in law enforcement.
And in Amati's case, it ultimately led to his capture. A viewer tip from someone in Georgia ended his run from justice.
It's just a powerful example of how media, when used effectively, can really contribute to public safety. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a safer society.
Now, turning to the trial itself, it seemed like a legal maze. Charges dropped against the accomplices. Amati acquitted of 2 of the murders. What are your thoughts on all of this? Was justice truly served?
That's a complex question. The decision to drop the charges against Samson and James was a direct result of that withheld evidence. Without that crucial piece of the puzzle, the prosecution just couldn't meet the burden of proof required for a conviction.
But why would evidence be withheld in the first place? Was it intentional or just an oversight?
It's hard to say with any certainty. It could have been a strategic move by the defense, a procedural error, or even just an unintentional oversight. The rules of evidence are intricate, And sometimes even the slightest misstep can have, significant consequences.
So even though Samson and James were involved in the robbery and present at the murders, they were essentially set free on a technicality.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. But it's also a reflection of the principle of due process, which is a cornerstone of our legal system. The burden of proof lies with the prosecution, and without sufficient admissible evidence, a conviction cannot be secured.
And then there's Amati's acquittal on 2 of the murders. Was that also influenced by the withheld evidence?
Possibly, but the jury's decision likely involved a ton of factors. Remember, Amati claimed that he never pulled the trigger, that he acted out of fear of Samson. The jury may have found his testimony compelling in those 2 instances, or they may have felt that the prosecution's evidence, even without the withheld portion, wasn't strong enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
So even with a conviction for 1 murder, there's still this cloud of uncertainty hanging over his involvement in the others.
Yeah, that's often the case in these complex criminal trials. The legal system strives for clarity and resolution, but sometimes ambiguities remain. And that can be really frustrating for those seeking a sense of closure, especially the victims' families.
You've mentioned the victims' families several times. Can you talk a bit more about the long-term impact on them? How do they cope with the aftermath of such horrific crimes?
It's an incredibly difficult journey. The loss of a loved one to violence is a trauma that can have profound, lasting effects. There's the initial shock and grief, followed by this long and arduous process of healing. Many families struggle with anger, guilt, a sense of injustice.
And we can't forget about Stacey Dooley, the witness who was shot in the leg during the murder of Keith Dyer. She survived, but I imagine that experience left its own scars.
Absolutely. Surviving a violent crime can be just as traumatic as losing a loved one to it. There's the physical pain, of course, but also the psychological trauma. Survivors often deal with PTSD, anxiety, a lingering fear that the violence could happen again.
It's a reminder that the impact of crime goes far beyond the immediate victims. It extends to witnesses, family members, friends, the community as a whole.
Exactly. And it underscores the need for comprehensive support systems for victims of crime, counseling, therapy, support groups, advocacy services. All these things can be crucial in helping individuals and families navigate the aftermath of trauma and begin that long process of healing.
Turning back to Amati, he's serving a life sentence, but is there any possibility of rehabilitation for someone who has committed such brutal acts? Can someone like him ever truly change?
That's a question that has no easy answers.
Yeah.
The capacity for change and redemption is deeply personal, and it varies from individual to individual. Some people, even those who have committed horrific acts, can find a path to remorse, empathy, personal transformation. Others may remain trapped in these cycles of anger, resentment, violence.
So is there any way to predict whether someone like Amati is capable of genuine rehabilitation?
It's a complex assessment. Involves looking at a multitude of factors: psychological makeup, criminal history, behavior in prison, willingness to engage in therapy and self-reflection. It's a process, not a guarantee, and there's always a degree of uncertainty.
It sounds like a long and arduous journey, both for the individual seeking redemption and for the system tasked with evaluating their progress.
It is. But the possibility of rehabilitation, however slim, is an important concept to hold on to. It reminds us that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope for change and redemption can exist.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The crimes, the investigation, the trial, the impact on the victims and the community. But there's one question that keeps lingering in my mind. What was it about Tony Ray Amati that made him capable of such brutality? Was he born evil, or was it something else, something in his environment or his experiences that shaped him into the thrill killer?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's rarely a simple answer. Human behavior is a complex tapestry, woven from countless threads: genetics, upbringing, trauma, societal influences, even random chance. They can all play a role in shaping who we become.
So while we can trace the events of Amati's life, we may never fully understand the inner workings of his mind, the forces that drove him to such darkness.
That's the challenge and the tragedy of cases like this. We can dissect the evidence, analyze the psychology, but ultimately we're left with a puzzle that may never be fully solved.
And that brings us to the heart of this deep dive, the search for understanding. Not just understanding the facts of the case, but understanding the human condition itself. We've been digging deep into the story of Tony Ray Amati, this man who seemingly lived a double life, a model student who becomes this notorious killer. And while we can analyze all the events, the evidence, the psychology, there's still that lingering question: why? What makes a seemingly ordinary person commit such horrific acts?
It's a question that has haunted, philosophers, criminologists, psychologists for centuries. Is evil innate? Or is it a product of our environment, our experiences, the choices we make?
We've talked about Amati's intelligence, his manipulative tendencies, even a possible fear of his accomplice, Troy Sampson. But do any of these factors truly explain his descent into violence?
It's rare to find a single satisfying answer. It's often this complex interplay of factors. Some individuals may be predisposed to violence because of genetic factors or neurological abnormalities. Others might be shaped by early childhood trauma, exposure to violence, a lack of positive role models.
So nature and nurture, they both play a role. But what about free will? At what point does someone choose to cross that line to embrace violence as a solution?
That's where things get even more complicated, right? We like to think we have complete control over our actions, but our choices are often influenced by a ton of factors, both conscious and unconscious. Our past experiences, our emotional state, even our immediate surroundings can all shape our decision-making.
It's like a perfect storm of circumstances that can push someone towards a path of destruction. But it still feels so difficult to grasp how someone like Amati, who by all accounts understood the difference between right and wrong, could make those choices.
It really challenges our fundamental understanding of human nature, doesn't it? We want to believe that there's this clear line between good and evil. But Amati's case, like many others, blurs that line. It forces us to acknowledge the darkness that exists within us all, that potential for violence that lies dormant in even the most seemingly ordinary individuals.
That's a chilling thought, but it also kind of raises an important question. If violence isn't simply a matter of good versus evil, how do we prevent it? How do we break the cycle?
That's the challenge, right? It requires this multifaceted approach, addressing social inequalities, providing early intervention programs for at-risk youth, promoting empathy and conflict resolution skills, and fostering a culture that rejects violence in all its forms.
It sounds like a monumental task, but I suppose understanding the complexities is the first step towards creating solutions.
Exactly. We need to move beyond these simplistic explanations and embrace the messy, nuanced reality of human behavior. We need to acknowledge the interplay of nature and nurture, the power of individual choice, the influence of societal factors. Only then can we hope to create a world where violence is no longer an acceptable solution.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, a descent into the heart of darkness, but also this search for understanding. We've examined the facts, grappled with the psychology, and confronted some uncomfortable truths about human nature.
So what stands out to you from all of this?
What strikes me most is the ripple effect. The violence didn't just end with the victims. It spread outwards, touching families, communities, even those of us trying to make sense of it all these years later. It's a sobering reminder that our actions have consequences, and those consequences can just reverberate far beyond our immediate circle.
I think that's a powerful takeaway. We are all interconnected, and the choices we make, for good or for ill, can have a profound impact on the world around us.
And that brings us to our final thought for our listeners. What do you want them to leave with today?
I'd encourage them to continue exploring, to keep asking questions. Never stop seeking understanding. The world is a complex and often challenging place, but it's also a place filled with beauty, resilience, and the potential for positive change. Hold on to that hope, embrace the complexities, and never underestimate your own power to make a difference.
Beautifully said. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the case of Anthony Ray Amati, and perhaps even on the human condition itself. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious.